Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you may be watching this, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube. I'm glad you're back because we're going to jump into Genesis chapter 10 here today. As always, feel free to like, share, comment, subscribe to the channel if you're on YouTube, subscribe to our Facebook channel or page, I should say, if you're on Facebook. And we're going to dive into chapter 10. So far up to this point, we've had a lot of kind of theological things. In chapter 10, it's not nearly as much theological as it is almost informational in a lot of ways. We're going to be looking at what is considered to be an incredibly accurate catalog of the ancient nations, extending out from Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And that's not just me as a Christian who's saying that. Secular historians such as Dr. William F. Albright and others, and Albright was at one time, a little while ago, a number of years ago, considered to be the leading authority on archaeology in the ancient Near East, said that what is laid out here in Genesis chapter 10 is a geographically, historically correct catalog of the Table of Nations. So that's what this is called. And we're going to jump into it. It's going to be, this is the kind of stuff that I love because I love history, I love facts. So I love looking at this stuff. But tag along, we're going to jump into Genesis chapter 10 here today. And it reads like this. Now these are the records of the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and the sons were born to them after the flood. The sons of Japheth were Gomer and Magog and Madai and Javan and Tubal and Meshech and Tiras. The sons of Gomer were Ashkenaz and Riphath and Togarmah. The sons of Javan were Elisha and Tarshish, Kittim and Dodanim. From these the coastlands of the nations were separated into their lands, everyone according to his language, according to their families, into their nations. Now, one thing we need to point out before we jump into it is that chapter 10 kind of takes a step out from time. The Tower of Babel, though we haven't read about it yet, has happened already when this is being written. So that's why it says according to their language and stuff like that, because the languages have already been scattered and the people have already been scattered. So just remember that. Though we haven't talked about the Tower of Babel yet, we will. Though it hasn't happened yet chronologically, this is inserted after that, just so that we're aware based on, so we know what's going on with languages and stuff like that. So let's stop there. Let's talk about Japheth and his sons and his grandsons. Okay? So there are 7 sons of Japheth, and when allowing for the changes that always occur in names over time, as well as looking at scriptural references and archaeology, Japheth's sons can be traced to be the ancestors of the Indo-European peoples, right? Now, I want to point this out. I know I mentioned it last week or maybe the week before, but I want to point this out. Shem, Ham, and Japheth do not have different skin colors. And then, I think it's, we'll see that Ham's children, I believe it is, if I remember correctly, end up in what is present day Africa and stuff like that. And so they were black. No, 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 no. Skin color is primarily a result of needing protection against the sun's UV rays, which is why, my wife is a pale-skinned ginger and her ancestors are from Ireland and stuff like that. Being that far north, they didn't need as much protection from the sun. So the skin's quite paler. Around the equator, as well as in, places like Africa, which large parts of Africa are around the equator, right? The sun's rays are more direct. The UV rays are more direct. And so, you needed a darker skin pigment, and over the course of a generation or two, it would not have taken long. Over the course of a generation or two, you would see that change occurring. So I want to make that clear from the jump, that we are not saying so Japheth is the Indo-European peoples. He did not look white or what the skin of an an Indonesian, an Indian sort of person would look like, right? From that descent, he didn't look like that. We don't actually know what they looked like. We have no idea. The Bible doesn't tell us what they looked like. So I just want to put that to bed, even as we begin here. This has nothing to do with what we would classify as race. It has just everything to do with where his descendants went and settled. Okay? So we're looking at the Indo-European peoples here with Japheth, and his children. The name Japheth is found in literature as Iapetus, the father of the Greeks, and Iapeteti, the ancestor of the Aryans in India. So his name is changed when it goes into a Greek form, right? That happens, right? Names are different based upon the language that you speak them in, as well as things can change. Like, for instance, you look at somebody like Jesus. Well, Jesus' real name is Yeshua, which its proper um, translation to English would have been actually Joshua. But over the course of changing throughout multiple translations, we got it to Jesus. Okay. It just happens when you change languages and things like that, words can change slightly. Um, so we see Japheth is found to be the father of the Greeks and the Indians, those in India. Gomer is generally identified by Herodotus, a ancient Greek historian, Plutarch, and other ancient Greek writers, with Chimeria, north of the Black Sea. They also moved westward with the name preserved both in Germany and Cambria or Wales. So his son Gomer then goes up northward to the Black Sea and then westward into what we would present day call Germany, and even so far as Wales out on the Atlantic in the Atlantic Ocean, right? Ashkenaz was identified with Germany by the Jews. And so it would appear as well that Ashkenaz went there as well, maybe forming a different tribe in what we would present day call Germany. Rippath, with the Carpathians and broader European ideas, and Togarma with the Armenians. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about Magog and Gog and a few others because that's a little bit more, it's a little bit deeper. So Magog is held to be the ancestors of what we would call the Scythians, right? And he is often associated with his two brothers, Meshech and Tubal. Meshech is present day preserved in Muscovy, the former name of Russia and Moscow. So if you can see where we're going here, right? North and to the east, a little bit of where, think of yourselves in the Middle East. That's where Canaan is. So north into the middle, into the east, excuse me, you find Russia and Moscow. Tubal is known in Assyrian monuments as Tiberini, probably preserved in the Russian city of Tobolsk. So again, you have slight changes because of language, but the name is the same. And generally speaking, these three, that being Magog, Meshech, and Tubal, are held to be the ancestors of the Russian people. So that area of the world. Medai is often the ancestor of the Medes. You might recognize them from the Medes and the Persians, right? That group of people that eventually is going to take Babylon. It'll take the Jews, Xerxes, Darius, all that, right? The Medes, who historically we know came out of where like India is. The word for Javan is translated elsewhere in the Old Testament as Greece and is the original form of Ionia, which was the same as Greece. So it looks like Javan also went with his father to Greece. Elishash was a form of Hellas, which can be applied to Greece as well. The Hellenists or the Hellenistic period, right? So again, we're still in Greece. Tarshish is often identified with Spain and Carthage. Those of these people we know were Phoenicians, which were Canaanites, right? The Canaanites became the Phoenicians, and they were in those areas of the world. So most likely, the area we think of Carthage and then Spain were originally settled by Tarshish and then taken over eventually by the Phoenicians. That's most likely what happened there. Then you have Kittim, is a reference to Cyprus. And it is possible that Ma Kittim, the land of Kittim, may have given rise to the name Macedonia. Again, we're taking some liberties based on language here, but people way smarter than me, and there's quite a lot of those, have worked through the language and the syntax, and this is what they say. Not me. This is what they say takes place. So again, we're still in that Greek area of the world, or what we would think of as Greece. And then the term Gentiles was applied to explicitly and specifically to the descendants of Japheth, the Indo-European peoples. The reference to them being divided by their tongue shows again, as I mentioned already, that chapter 10 was written after the dispersion at Babel, which we'll get to eventually. And the Japhethites were intellectual and philosophical. And Europe, of course, would later be the center of development for philosophy and science. Um, and so obviously other places contributed, right? I'm not trying to be like, well, Europe was so much smarter than everybody. Not at all. But your European and stuff like that have widely been held to be for a long time the centers of like the philosophy and different reformations that deal with um, that sort of thing, right? So that is the descendants of Japheth. Let's jump into the descendants of Ham. The sons of Ham were Cush and Mizraim and Put in Canaan. The sons of Cush were Seba and Havilah, and Sabta and Ramah and Sabteka. The sons of Ramah were Sheba and Dedan. Now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. From that land he went forth into Assyria, and built Nineveh, and Rehoboth Ir, and Calah, and Rezen between Nineveh and Calah. This is that great city. Mizraim became the father of Ludim, and Anamim, and Lehabim, and Nephtuim, and Pathrusim, and Casluhim, from which came the Philistines, and Captorim. Canaan became the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and Jebusite, and the Amorite, and the Girgashite, and the Hivite, and the Arkite, and the Sinite, and the Aravadite, and the Semirite, and the Hamathite, and afterward the families of the Canaanites were spread abroad. The territory of the Canaanite extended from Sidon, as you go toward Grear, as far as Gaza, as you go towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and Admah and Zeboim, as far as Lasha. These are the sons of Ham, according to their families, according to their languages, by their lands, by their nations. Now, if you remember right, one second, excuse me. If you remember right, Ham is the one whom Noah says, you are going to be a servant to your brothers, right? Your descendants will be a servant to your brothers. Let's talk about what he meant by that here. So Cush, or Kish, as it is sometimes translated, is often translated as Ethiopia. So we're going into Africa now. It would appear the Cushites or the Kishites migrated south to Arabia, then crossed the Red Sea to Ethiopia, right? Mizraim is the ancestor of the Egyptians. It is the customary name for Egypt in the Bible. It is called the land of Ham in Psalm 105, which may mean that Ham accompanying Mizraim to present day Egypt. And Mizraim is plural. It may not be the exact form of his name. It may actually be Menes, Menes, the legendary founder of Egypt's first dynasty. That would make sense. And then Put is the same as Libya in the Bible and is applied to North Africa west of Egypt. And Canaan is the ancestor of the Canaanites. That kind of makes sense, right? So remember, now we're going into Africa, as well as other places. Seba then migrated across the Red Sea to Sudan and throughout Arabia and Africa. And the other sons are also known to be throughout the land of Arabia. Cush's most famous son settled in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, that being Nimrod. Nimrod means let us rebel, and this may show that Cush and his descendants were ready again for open rebellion of God. And we're training Nimrod to be the leader of this rebellion. Remember that names mean something, especially back then. Names still mean something today. But back then, you gave a person a name very specifically. And so to name your kid Let Us Rebel shows your heart. We are going to rebel. And of course, it is Nimrod who's going to lead the people in open rebellion against God, cause the Tower of Babel incident to happen that we'll get to eventually. Nimrod's people settled in Shinar, most likely later identified as Sumer, and began to build a city complex, the beginning of the kingdom of Babel. And he acquired his reputation as a hunter. And this hunting is most likely not for food, because most of the fierce animals, there's a large food supply, right? But he most likely got this because he was fighting against the fierce animals for the food. So he was known as this great hunter, not because he hunted deer so great, but because he took down lion, bear, that sort of thing. right? Next, we move on to Erech, who is also called Uruk. And if you're unsure of that, Uruk was the name of one of the great cities of the world at that time. And Uruk was 100 miles southeast of Babylon and is the legendary home of Gilgamesh, hero of the Babylon flood story. And the excavation of the city of Uruk has yielded examples of writing long predating the time of Abraham. One of the things that people say for why what Genesis can't be real is because people didn't know how to write and stuff back then. Well, they've actually proven archaeology that they did. They knew how to write and stuff like that because they found it. So people would say, well, the story of Noah happens, that the Jewish story of Noah comes after Gilgamesh. Well, actually, it doesn't. Gilgamesh comes after Noah, and or at least the story of Gilgamesh, I should say, comes after Noah, and it is a kind of flood story. It misses the some of the important parts of the flood story. And then Akkad, another city, was north of Babylon and was known also as Akkad, A-K-K, not A-C-C, and it gave his name to the Akkadian Empire, again synonymous with the Sumerian Empire. So we're dealing with the Sumerians primarily here, right? And he also went to Assyria, where he builds other cities, including Nineveh, which is 200 miles north of Babylon, and would become the capital of Assyria. Nineveh would be famous for the story of Jonah and the big old fish, right? So it was still around hundreds or thousands of years later at that point. The sons of Mizraim, the founder of Egypt, are largely unidentified. They were most likely important tribes near Egypt at the time of the writing of Genesis 10. And the Philistines came out of Kalushim and Kaphtorim, and secular writings tell us that the Philistines came out of Crete. And so it is likely that Kalushim and Kaphtorim migrated to Crete and then eventually to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean to become the Philistines, right? And then we see Sidon was the ancestor of the Phoenicians, and Heth was the ancestor of the Hittites. Genesis 23 tells us that. And he ruled an empire in Asia Minor, not he himself, but right, the Hittites, for over 800 years. The Hittites were around. And present in Canaan with Abraham and still had great power at the time of Solomon 1,000 years later. So while they weren't at their height anymore, they still had great power 1,000 years after this writing of Genesis, that as Solomon knows them as the Hittites as having power. And we know that from Second Chronicles 1:17. The Jebusites, then, and I know we're on a lot of them here. Ham had a lot of sons. The Jebusites were the early inhabitants of Jerusalem, according to Joshua 15. So we know the Jebusites, where they are. The Amorites were an extremely prominent tribe, and their names used to represent of all of the Canaanites, right? The Sinites were very interesting. They were possibly insignificant because we don't know much about them, but their name is very similar to biblical names, the wilderness of Sin, Mount Sinai, Sinim, which suggests that they may have had much greater influence than what was realized before. They just don't have necessarily a lot written about them. There's a tendency in early tribes toward ancestor worship and deification, right? Which may be reflected in the frequent use of the name Sin in ancient pantheons to represent certain gods. Not sin in what we call wrongdoing, just that was the person's name. Okay. In fact, one of the most prominent Assyrian gods was Sin. And Canaan's son, Sin, may have been very prominent enough to give his name to a wide region and have influence in the Sumerian Assyrian homeland. And then biblical reference in Isaiah 49 to the people in the Far East named Sinim, together with secular histories of the Sinai, suggest that some of Sim's descendants then migrated eastward. Okay? The prefix Sino was has identified the Chinese people for generations, for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So it looks like they would have migrated all the way to China. The evidence is somewhat flimsy or circumstantial, but of all the names in the table of nations, it seems the two sons of Canaan, Heth, the Hittites, Kittite, Kithai, and Sin, the Sinites, Sinim, China, are likely to be the ancestors of the Oriental people, of people from the Orient, from Asia, right? And it is reasonable that divine inspiration would include in such a table information concerning the ancestry of all major strains of human development. And it is reasonable to conclude that the Mongoloid peoples, therefore the American Indians, have mostly come from the Hamitic lines, right? As they go over into Asia, and then the land bridge forms, and they go over into what is present day North America, and then down through into present day South America. Most likely came from the Hamitic lines. The Bible makes the statement that the families of the Canaanites spread abroad, the only one this is made about. This suggests that these tribes spread out more than the other peoples. And think about it, we have talked about all the way from Africa up through Asia and across down into North and South America. It encompasses a vast majority of the world. Makes sense then that they would have spread abroad. Again, we are given evidence that Genesis 10 was written after the Tower of Babel, as there was only one tongue before that point. And it also suggests that the division of tongues was not random, but by families, making it so each family could make a country and become a kingdom. Okay? And again, Ham's line is tasked with they end up creating and expanding upon technology and architecture and things like of that nature, farming and all that kind of stuff, and therefore make it so that Japheth's line and Shem's line can actually survive. And it is in that way that they are a slave to Japheth and Shem, not slaves in that they are owned, but in that their contributions to the world have literally made it so we can eat and drink and sleep and all that kind of stuff in a better way. We're going to stop there because it's in Shem's line that we read quite a lot. And we're already at about 20 minutes, a little over, and I want to give us a proper amount of time as we talk about Shem's line. So, as always, if you have questions, comments, concerns, that sort of thing, feel free to leave them below. I would love to talk to you guys and answer questions and stuff like that. Like, share, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. God bless, guys. We will see you next Friday as we look at Shem's line. God bless, guys.